Good evening, everyone. Now that we have the mic on, thank you. Welcome to the USGS for this September's public lecture. I am Phil Frederick. I am a geologic map editor with the Menlo Park Publishing Service Network. And again, thank you for being here. I'm glad that you're here. Before we get into introductions, just as a quick reminder, October's lecture will be here, but it'll be much earlier in the month, October 10th. Yeah, it's very early. Now, to remind yourselves, and it looks like you have, just pick up a flyer in the back, this nice kind of blue gradient flyer. That lecture is going to be on the anniversary of the Loma Prieta earthquake and will feature a panel of speakers. However, today's lecture is on bats in the West, discoveries, questions, and future research, presented by Gabriel Reyes. Gabe is a biologist with the Western Ecological Research Center for the USGS, stationed out of the Dixon Field Station. And for those of you who are not familiar where that is near the center of the Central Valley of California. Gabe started here at the USGS 3 years ago in 2016 after completing his master's degree at Humboldt State University, where he studied the social behavior of Hoary bats, which are a solitary and migratory tree roosting bat. He also worked for several years in environmental consulting, primarily working on bats and the effects of energy development on wildlife. Gabe is currently focusing on the ecology of western bats, which includes the distribution, roosting habitat, and even population monitoring techniques to help fill in data gaps that can be used to improve conservation and management of bat populations in the West. Besides all of those interests and focuses, he is also an enthusiast of parasites, insects, and snakes. So please join me in welcoming Gabriel.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes. Cool. Thanks for coming. So just a quick overview of what I'm going to be discussing. We're going to quickly go over bat evolution and diversity, the ecological importance of bats, conservation challenges and issues, and bats. What? Oh, sorry. And putting it all together into our research. So the order bats is the order Chiroptera, and Chiroptera means hand wing. They get that name because their finger bones are elongated, which makes up the structure of the wing. And the evolution of bats was kind of a mystery that people argued about, looking at fossils and extant bats for a long time. But this is one of the oldest examples of a bat fossil, and it's from about 50 million years ago, discovered in Wyoming. And it looks pretty much like a modern bat. It has all the same features. There's evidence that it could echolocate already. Recently, evidence has placed bats in the Lasiurus. This isn't my expertise, so I'll stumble through some of these names. And the Chiroptera are sister taxa to the Vespertilionidae and the Perissodactyla, which are the ancestors or include. Uh-oh. Is it back? I just won't move. Which is the common ancestor of camels, whales, and ungulates. So that's pretty interesting. They're not at all related to rodents or shrews or things like that. The order Chiroptera is broken into two suborders, and it used to be a lot easier to remember. There was the Megachiroptera, which were the old world fruit bats, and the Microchiroptera, which were everything else. However, now they're recognized as the Yangochiroptera, which includes the old world fruit bats, the family Pteropodidae, which over here look like flying foxes, hence their name, and then also the family Megadermatidae. And these are all old world bats that are widespread throughout Africa, Southeast Asia, Asia, but don't occur in the Americas. The other suborder is the Yangochiroptera, previously known as the Microchiroptera. And these are kind of thought of as the microbats, bats that evolved to eat insects. However, they've diversified quite a lot. So this is kind of a typical bat that you might see around here, but there's a tremendous amount of diversity in ecological niches, feeding behaviors, and everything. So in Central America, you have these guys, which are the Honduran white bats, or Ectophyla alba. And they get their white coloration because they form little tents that they live in by chewing on leaves and collapsing the leaf structure. And then if you're ever in a jungle and you look up, you see lots of light coming through, and it's thought that the white coloration might help with camouflage in that situation. These cute little bats that are smiling at you, these are actually vampire bats. And there's 3 species of vampire bats. They occur from Mexico down south into South America. 2 species specialize on mammalian blood, and 1 species specializes on bird blood. And they actually have anticoagulants in their saliva. So when they're feeding, they sense where a vein is or a source of blood, and then they make a little nick with their teeth, and then they lap up the blood like a kitten drinking milk. And they're actually a really interesting study species for the evolution of reciprocal altruism, where bats will feed each other if they weren't able to feed successfully. There's a couple species of bats that have evolved to eat fish. So this is the bulldog bat, also found in Central and South America. And they have these giant feet, and they can detect fish swimming up to the surface and then scoop them up and eat them. This is a bat, the Trachops, and all those lumps on its chins, it's thought that those might be chemical sensory organs, which they use to identify whether their prey is safe to eat or not, and they use them because they're hunting frogs. So they listen for frogs calling, and then go down and then can tap them really quickly, and if it's palatable, gobble it up, and if it's not kill themselves by eating a poisonous frog. And I have no idea what this species is or how it got its face, but I'll just leave that there. Locally, we have, and by locally I mean in the kind of greater Bay Area, we have 16 species of bats in 2 families, the Vespertilionidae and the Molossidae. And while there's a bunch of commonalities in all of our local bats, they all eat insects, they all live fairly long times for animals of their sizes, and for the most part only have 1 or 2 pups per year. There's also quite a lot of variation in their ecology. So we have some bats that are migratory and largely solitary. Both of these species are pretty social. However, in their feeding ecology, a bat like this might forage for little insects emerging off of the surface of a pond, whereas this bat, the pallid bat, is going to go after much larger prey, and I'll go into that in a second. So the genus Myotis is a pretty common and widespread genus throughout the world. Here, locally, we have 6 species, and like I said, some of them specialize in aquatic emergent insects. Other bats like this, and I lost the cursor, the bat on the left side of the screen is the western long-eared Myotis, and this is actually a gleaning species of bat. So they'll detect prey that's sitting on leaves and then scoop it up, so they're not going after flying prey as much, and they're specialized for the cluttered interior of forests. The pallid bat listens for prey walking on the ground, so they'll listen for Jerusalem crickets, scorpions, large beetles, and then land on the ground and get stung a bunch and kind of have a little battle and fly off with it. And they're an incredible species to work with. We have them in several of our study areas. And then the hoary bat, this is the species that I did my master's on. They got hoary in the name as a description of their fur, means frosty fur. It's not a description of their mating system. But they're a long-distance migrant. The females travel up north, up to Canada to raise their pups. The males seem to migrate not quite as far. And if you look at distribution maps and people who are working on trying to figure out the movement patterns, it just becomes a confusing mess. We really barely understand their movement patterns, and it's really fascinating. The species roost solitarily in the foliage of trees, so they'll just be hanging on the branch of a redwood tree or something and just kind of look like a little pine cone or dead leaf or something.
I understand they migrated to Hawaii?
Yes, so it's also the only native land mammal in Hawaii, which is a testament to their amazing flying ability. So during migration, presumably, they flew off the coast of California, ended up in Hawaii, and there's actually evidence that they've done that several times. And now there's an endangered subspecies of Hawaiian hoary bat. And they're the second largest bat in the US.
Which is how big?
Maybe that big. They weigh about 25 grams, so 5 nickels. And then an example of the Molossids, or free-tailed bats. This is the Mexican free-tailed bat. You also hear people call it the Brazilian free-tailed bat. The species is an open-air forager, so they're kind of specialized to hunt prey high up in the sky, flying thousands of feet up, and they form large maternity colonies. So some of the giant bat caves in Texas, where you have 4 or 5 million bats, that's the species. And they're migratory in some parts of their range.
They migrate to Mexico. How did they get the Brazilian name?
I think they occur in Brazil as well, but I'm not sure. So why study bats? I would argue they're just an amazing, unappreciated, and unstudied member of our ecosystem. There's an incredible amount of diversity. Currently, there's 1,408 recognized species in the world, and that represents about 20% or almost a quarter of mammalian diversity. And they're present on every continent except for Antarctica. So that works for me as a reason to focus on them. But also, they provide really important ecosystem services. And an example of that is their importance to agriculture. So most bats in North America are insectivorous, and they eat a lot of bugs. Some bats can eat 1,000 mosquitoes in an hour, half their body weight in bugs in a night. And they're voracious predators. And trying to quantify the benefits that this has for agriculture, people have done field experiments where they see what happens if they exclude bats from agricultural plots. So they'll put netting over portions of fields at night and not let bats come in, and then open it up so birds can still get in. And they'll find that there's increased insect damage to those crops, increased numbers of like caterpillars and things that farmers don't like to have to deal with. And in this paper, from studies primarily looking at agriculture in Texas, looking at corn and cotton, they quantified the avoided cost value of the services that bats provide at about $74 an acre. And that's in farmers not having to apply pesticides and not losing crops to damage. And if you extrapolate that across the country, you get into the billions of dollars in services provided. I believe the minimum value is about $3 billion, and it could potentially be up in the tens of billions of dollars in services per year. Also, like I said, most bats in the Americas are insectivorous. However, there's 2 species of bats, or not in the Americas, in the US. There's 2 species of bats that are nectar feeding specialists. This is the lesser long-nosed bat, and they specialize on drinking nectar from night-blooming agaves and cactuses. And agaves are a really important crop to produce tequila with. This is a study published by USGS authors from the Fort Collins Science Center, but they were studying these nectar-feeding bats in the very northern part of their range during migration, and just looking at their movement patterns and foraging. And normally when you have 2 species that feed on similar types of things, they try and partition the resources so they're not competing directly with each other. However, in this range, both species migrate into a similar area, and it turns out they roost actually in similar caves, kind of commingling with each other and forage in similar habitats. And the caves that they were roosting in were about 20 kilometers away from their foraging grounds. So they would make that trip back and forth throughout the night. One of these species, the lesser long-nosed bat, was an endangered species, and a lot of work by US and Mexican bat biologists. They worked to protect important cave resources for them and study their movement ecology, and they were actually delisted. So it's a pretty cool success story for bat conservation. A colleague, Rodrigo Medin, who's at the Institute of Ecology at the University of Mexico, recognized the importance of these bats to agaves and tequila production, and also the importance of, and vice versa. So when bats pollinate the agaves, that increases the genetic diversity of the agaves, and that can allow them to withstand changes like emerging diseases, or as the climate changes, the plants might be more resilient to that. And so he actually worked to develop a bat-friendly tequila and mezcal certification, where producers will agree to allow a certain proportion of their agaves to go to flower before harvesting, and that provides food resources for these bats during migration. So it's a cool win-win story, and they're starting to send more and more bat-friendly tequila and mezcal to the US. So yeah, it's yeah, win-win for everyone. So I'm going to switch gears now and talk a little bit about conservation concerns. So bats, like most species of wildlife, have to deal with common issues like habitat loss and fragmentation. There might not be enough land as there used to be, and that can have effects. And then also in certain parts of the world, hunting and harassment also. So in some parts of the world, people hunt bats for food. In other places, there's a lot of stigma associated with bats, and people might, destroy intentionally or otherwise bat habitat because they're afraid of bats. However, recently, so this is a paper published just a few years ago by Tom O'Shea and Paul Cryan at the USGS Fort Collins Science Center, and they were looking at mass mortality events in bats, and they just searched the literature for times when lots of bats died and looked at that over time. And going back into the literature, starting in the 1800s, there would be disease outbreaks, there would be hunting, various things like that would carry on. But since about the year 2000, mass mortality events started to increase a lot. And the two things that increase that are wind turbines and white nose syndrome. And these are kind of large things that are affecting bat populations potentially, which are some of the big focuses of our research now. So white nose syndrome is a fungal pathogen that kills bats, and it gets its name from these kind of white growths that form on the muzzle of hibernating bats when they're infected with it. And it's caused by a cold-loving fungus called Pseudogymnoascus destructans, or PD, which is much easier to say. And it's a fungus that's actually widespread throughout Europe and Asia. And in Europe and Asia, the range that it presumably evolved in, bats get infected. Occasionally, they show some symptoms from it, but it doesn't cause mass mortality. It's probably like a mild annoyance or like athlete's foot or something like that. However, it was introduced into the Americas, and the naive, unexposed bats in the Americas, it's been causing huge mortality in some populations and some areas. So it attacks the bats or invades their tissues while they're hibernating. Bats go into torpor, which means that they slow down their metabolic rate, slow down their breathing, and also suppress their immune system. And they do that to survive long winter times when they can't forage successfully. So during that time period, that's the optimal growth temperature for PD. The bats also have a suppressed immune system, so they can't mount a defense against it, and they start to arouse frequently from irritation from the fungus, and then they just burn through their fat reserves before they can forage successfully in the spring. And in some species and in some hibernacula, you can see upwards of 90% mortality. And this is a bit outdated, but as of 2012, there was over 6.7 million bats that were thought to have died. And this is a map that the USGS National Wildlife Health Center puts out. So they update this frequently when there's new records of it. And you can see if the cursor shows up, which it's not. Oh, there it is. Wait. There we go. So here in Albany, New York, this is basically ground zero for the infection starting in the Americas in probably 2005. And then it started to spread out kind of how you would expect a bat-to-bat transmitted disease would spread out, kind of, every now and then there's some jumps. But then in 2016, it jumped to Washington State. So that could have been transported perhaps on a human who had been inside a cave and gotten exposed to it, and shortly after went to somewhere in Washington that bats were, or it could have been inadvertently transported by an infected bat, maybe being moved in like a shipping container or truck or something. They're not really sure how it jumped to that location. And so that was really concerning because that was just such a big jump, and it caught bat researchers on the West Coast kind of off guard. And then just recently, we had some equivocal detections in California. And what I mean by equivocal is the labs that are testing for, so we surveil for this disease by swabbing bats and then sending the swabs to the Wildlife Health Center, and they do quantitative PCR on it. And sometimes they get results where they detect something, but it's below the positive threshold that they would consider a positive sign for an infection, and that could be a false positive. It could also just be a very low concentration of the pathogen. And so there were 4 detections at the same site over 2 years, so that was pretty concerning, and California decided to go public with the findings to increase research on the area and also increase caution among bat research and people who might be entering caves or hibernacula. No, it's not. It was detected in a maternity colony, actually, in a town, I believe, up there in Lassen County.
What accounts for the pattern of how it's moved across the country?
So she asked what accounts for the pattern across for how it moved across the country. I'm not exactly sure. It started out just kind of radiating from the site, and part of it could be kind of overlapping with where large hibernacula of bats are. So kind of along the Appalachians and stuff where you have large caves. Some of these detections, like down in Texas, the fungus is spreading around, but you're actually not seeing signs of the disease there because it doesn't get cold enough for bats to need to hibernate. So they're kind of transporting the fungus around, but not suffering disease symptoms. So the other big issue highlighted in that paper is wind energy development. And wind energy is increasingly popular carbon neutral source of energy that's widespread throughout the world. And early on in the development of wind energy facilities, people were really concerned about bird fatalities. And biologists would go out and survey and look for dead things and try and quantify the impacts that this might have on birds. And they found during certain times of the year and at certain sites, they would start to see lots of bats. There would just be like these peaks in bats where they would start to find dozens in a day. And a paper that was done in 2008 to look at the patterns of bat fatalities across wind energy facilities in North America looked at the species composition, and they found, let's see, here it is. So Lacey is Lasiurus cinerius, or the Latin name for hoary bat, and this hoary bats account for almost half of the fatalities at wind energy sites. And some of the other highly impacted species include the eastern red bat and the silver-haired bat, and these are all migratory species of bats. So there seems to be just a subset of species that are being impacted by wind energy, and then other sites occur in, or other species suffer fatalities at lower rates. And the thing about hoary bats, when I was talking about them earlier, I said that they're solitary, they roost in trees, they're impossible to study. They fly really high, so we don't really have any idea of what the population sizes are. So it's concerning to see these fatality rates across wind energy sites, but we don't know what kind of impact that will have.
Do they fly higher than the freetails? I think the Mexican freetail fly 10,000 feet sometimes.
She asked how high hoary bats fly. So there are accounts, or there's one account of a plane striking a hoary bat at about 8,000 feet. So the Air Force would track wildlife strikes, and then somebody at the Smithsonian can ID the wildlife based off of that. So we don't know how common that is, or if that was a fluke, but yeah, so they potentially do fly as high as Mexican free-tailed bats. We don't know how common that is, though. Oh, and there's a hoary bat. The study published just a couple weeks ago, actually, was looking at acoustic monitoring data from a monitoring program conducted in Oregon and Washington from about the year 2000 to maybe 2012 to a more recent nationwide bat monitoring program called NABAT, or North American Bat Monitoring, which is managed by the US Geological Survey. And they were estimating occupancy rates. So occupancy is a measure of basically how likely a species is to occur in an area. And you can kind of think of it as an index of population, but not exactly. And they compared occupancy rates earlier in time to more recent occupancy rates from the more recent survey efforts. And on the right-hand graph, this is the older data, and you can see everywhere it's yellow, that suggests a high occupancy rate. And then as you get into more shades of green, that's lower occupancy rates. And on the left-hand side, this is the more recent survey results. And this suggests a region-wide decline in occupancy. And wind energy is thought to be the primary factor behind this. So it's a really interesting and creative way to try and get at population trends, but it does require a lot of research to get those baseline data and have something to compare it to, because right now we really don't have those kinds of data for most of our bat species.
Do the hoary bats hibernate?
I'll get into that later. So how do we learn about wild bats? Bats are very tricky to study. They're largely silent to our ears. They fly high. They get into really small nooks and crannies. And they're out at night when most people are asleep, unless you decide to become a bat biologist. So one of the techniques that has actually been really helpful is acoustic monitoring. So this exploits the trait that bats use to navigate and hunt for prey, where they echolocate. Bats produce echolocation fairly regularly, and species will have echolocation calls that are adapted to help them navigate through the environments that they live in and catch the kinds of prey that they hunt. And so this is an example of a bat pass, which is what we call a series of echolocation calls. And so on the y-axis, you have frequency in kilohertz, so how high-pitched is the sound. And on the x-axis, you have time in milliseconds. And human hearing goes up to about 20 kilohertz. If you're a young kid who hasn't gone to a lot of rock concerts or made other poor decisions in life, and as you get older, the upper range of your hearing will start to decrease. So in older adults, it might be like 15 kilohertz or so. This bat, a Myotis, produces calls that start at about 100 kilohertz and sweep down to about 50 kilohertz. And this provides a lot of detail about tiny types of prey. And so you can identify that and know that one of these guys flew by the microphone. And the programs work by comparing calls that we record in the wild to known reference libraries. So researchers would go out, catch bats, and then release them and record their calls. So you have a species and a call type attached to that. However, unlike birds, which evolve their songs to communicate and differentiate themselves from other species, bats that hunt for similarly sized prey and similar habitats and are similar sizes, their calls will evolve to look really similar. So you'll end up with multiple species that have very similarly shaped calls. So this is actually two different species, a Yuma Myotis and a California Myotis. And the differences are really subtle. So the California Myotis has more of what we call a tail that dips down at the end of it. The Yuma Myotis has what we call a knee, so there's kind of a upper part and then a more abrupt break into the lower part. But besides that, these calls are very similar. So a lot of times we can't definitively ID calls to species. And then some other issues associated with acoustic monitoring is this doesn't give you a population count. It just tells you how many times a bat flew by. So you don't know if you're getting one bat flying in circles around your mic 100 times or 100 bats flying by your microphone once. So that's one of the drawbacks. One of the benefits of it is you can record a lot of data. You can put these in habitats that might be difficult to sample with other methods. One of the main ways that we catch bats for studying them is with mist netting. So picture a giant volleyball net made of really fine mesh, and we string these across flyways where we think bats might be flying. And the bats will be coming along, and then the ones that are paying attention can actually detect the net, and you'll see them just kind of like whoop, like right over the top or right underneath or turn around. But the ones that aren't paying attention, we can catch. And they'll get tangled up, and then we carefully extract them. And then we can take them and process them and record lots of biological data. So we can determine the species, the reproductive status, the sex. We can also take tissue samples for genetic analysis or hair samples for other types of analysis. And we can attach tracking devices to them. And then afterwards, hopefully this will play right, we let them go. And it's funny, often they're very feisty when they're in hand and like, don't touch me. And then you try and let them go and they just sit there. And they often need just a little boop to be on their way. There's also many visual techniques that we use to study bats, and often this can be as simple as counting bats where they're easy to count. So this is a paper that was just published in 2015 by my supervisor, Brian Halstead, and Gary Fellers, who's an emeritus at USGS who worked in Point Reyes for a long time. And this was on 25 years of monitoring at Townsend's big-eared bat colony in Point Reyes. And Townsend's big-eared bats are a species that's very sensitive to disturbance. They're a species of special concern, and they're a cavernous rooster, so they'll often just kind of be in the open ceiling of their roosts, and if people disturb them, they're prone to just abandon their young and kind of fail as a maternity colony for the season. And there's a house there that we've been monitoring. Gary Feller started this years and years ago, but we use a night vision scope with infrared spotlight. So the night vision scope can see the light, but the bats can't. And then you sit there and stare at it, and we have a little counter thing where you press one button every time a bat flies out, and another button every time a bat flies back in. And it feels like a kind of Lumosity brain training game where you just sit there for an hour and a half, just like boop, 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 boop. And at the end of the night, you get a count of the number of bats that were in that roost that night. And using that data, looking at the trend over time, they found comparing the population size, the number of bats in the roost, to the number of successful or unsuccessful break-ins into the house where kids would like to go in there to drink or stay there for a little bit. They found that every time there was a break-in attempt, the bat population would crash and not do as well. And then the Park Service started securing the house. They put these big beefy locks on it, security cameras, and checking on it and making sure that people didn't disturb it, and they were actually managing it for the bats. And the number of break-ins decreased dramatically, and the population has just been steadily increasing since then. And then this video didn't work, but I have one on YouTube. So you can also use visual techniques to try and study bats as they're doing their bat-like things flying around in the environment. So Paul Cryan at Fort Collins has been using thermal cameras to try and study bat behavior at wind turbines. And this is about 300 feet up in the air, so it's an 80-meter tall wind turbine, and you can see these bats flying around and inspecting the nacelle. And they're using this kind of data to try and learn about why bats might be vulnerable to wind turbine strikes, and then that can hopefully lead to solutions. So yeah, it's a very creative way to try and study bats in the natural habitat. Or, wait, I don't want that. Sorry, 1 second. And then lastly, tracking techniques. So if you're studying flying foxes, these massive bats, you can put these great GPS trackers on them. So on the right side, you can see a GPS tracker. Oftentimes these things will have solar panels on them. They record GPS locations, and then you can go back to your office and get emails of the bat's location and get really nice movement data. However, a lot of the bats that we're studying are tiny. Many weigh about as much as a nickel. And so we have to work with much more limited battery space, much more limited technology, but we have these amazing radio transmitters that we can glue onto bats, and they just emit a simple beep. The batteries last a week to 2 weeks, and the trackers weigh about 0.2 to 0.5 grams for some of the smaller bats that we're tracking. So that's how we're trying to study movement ecology around here. Hopefully over time the technology will get better and the GPS tags will get small enough where I can just sit in my office and get emails. But until then, we have to kind of run around after the bats using antennas to study them. And we actually do have tags that weigh about a gram, but they don't transmit data. So you have to recapture the bat to get your data back, which can be very challenging, especially when studying migratory animals. So I'm going to talk now about putting it all together, kind of our thought process in designing a project that we're doing. So when I started at USGS, we were working on projects that we wanted to address research needs, so kind of academic things that could really help us understand and help manage bats into the future. You know, how will white nose syndrome affect bats in the western US? How do we monitor populations? And we also wanted to address management needs of our Department of Interior partners. So that could be like, what kinds of habitats are important for bats? How are the populations doing? Do you need to make any management decisions? And so in 2016, OneTam, which is a collaboration set up by the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy with members of National Park Service, state parks, Water District, and county parks, published a Health of the Mountain report where they tried to quantify all the biotic and abiotic factors on Mount Tamalpais. And they had great trend lines on how the owl population was doing and all these other species of wildlife. But bats were identified as a major data gap where they just didn't know what species were there, were the rare species that might be there actually in the area, and how were the populations doing. So we developed a project with them where we set up these goals: study the nocturnal habitat use and habitat associations of bats, learn more about forest roosting's habitat of understudied species, which is basically all of the species in the area. So what types of features are important for bats? And then do these to just fill in data gaps to give land managers better information to inform their long-term conservation of bat populations. And we actually replicated this project that we started in Marin County, and we're also doing a parallel project in Pinnacles. So first, to address the nocturnal habitat associations, we are using acoustic monitoring to address that. And so for the first year, we didn't want to make any assumptions about bats. We decided to just select 50 random locations across all the different habitat types. And for the summer, we would take a bat detector out to each location and place it there for 1 week. And then we had 6 detectors that we kind of randomly rotated across all our 50 sites. And then we use SonarBat, which is the program that classifies bat calls to species to do a first pass on species ID. And then I also decided to manually vet all the calls that we recorded, which meant looking at about 60,000 bat calls, and was a terrible decision, but it did improve our results. And then we recorded various habitat metrics at the site, and we're working on a multi-species occupancy model, so that's integrating results from all the different species, but we're still in the process of that, and I'm just going to present single species occupancy models here. So our focal area was basically all public lands in Marin County, and so this is the random locations that we selected, and you have a lot of points that are in Mount Tamalpais and these larger contiguous areas of protected habitat, but we also have several sites that are very close to urban or urban and suburban development and much more isolated. And we would go out and set up a detector on a 20-foot pole and leave it there for a week and go back and get the data. And so we collected over 60,000 files that passed the tolerance scrubber, so that's a thing to remove the worst noise from our files. And then we were left with 12,400 files with bats, and this was after me looking at all of them. Again, terrible decision. But after doing manual vetting, we detected 13 out of 13 species, which are all the species that we expected to occur in the area. And this is a lot of numbers. I'm not going to go into it too much, but I just want to focus on the number of sites that each species was detected at. And so you can see that some species, like the California Myotis and the Mexican free-tail bat, Tadorida brasiliensis, were very widespread and kind of occurred like pretty much throughout everywhere, whereas several other species, like Myotis ovotis, which is the western long-eared Myotis, and the Myotis volans, which is the long-legged Myotis, those were much more restricted. And Myotis ovotis especially is a harder species to detect, so that could be part of it, but yeah. And this is kind of a funner way to look at the same data. So this is just the number of species detected at each site. So larger dots have more species. The largest ones have 11 species, and then several dots out, especially in the coast, had 1 or sometimes no species detected. And this is kind of what you would expect. There's lots of species richness in the larger protected areas or contiguous protected habitats, but we had some sites out in eastern Marin also where we had lots of species richness. And these sites were actually, or one of these sites was surrounded by water district land, which was these giant treatment ponds, which were basically a huge marsh. And so that explains why it's such productive habitat for that site. After our initial year of the 50 random points, we switched to protocols outlined in the USGS North American Bat Monitoring Program. And this is where you're intentionally placing your microphones in locations that you expect to be extra batty. So this could be in riparian areas or along ponds or edges of forests, things like that. And you leave them for 4 nights instead of 1 week. And this data we're going to be using over time to look at occupancy trends in our bat species to see if there's any issues of concern or if bats seem like they're stable. And this will also be provided to the California and nationwide efforts to monitor trends in bat occupancy. So these are the locations that we're using for that data. And so the entire continent is actually broken up into grids, and each 10-kilometer grid is broken into quadrants, and you put one detector in each quadrant. So that's what you see here. And we only have 2 years of data, which isn't long enough to establish trend lines, but this is just a first pass of the kinds of data that we'll be able to generate from doing this monitoring long term. So you can see, so on the y-axis you have the number of sites that each bat species was detected at. And then on the x-axis, it's just the different species. And so blue is 2018, the first year, and green is 2019. And you have little increases and decreases for most species, which is about what you would expect. There's some things like the western red bat, you can see a pretty big decline. And I wouldn't be too concerned about that with only 2 years of data, but over time we'll be able to see, is that a long-term trend that we need to worry about, or is that just a blip where we didn't detect as many that year for whatever reason? To look at roosting habitat preferences of bats, we used radio tracking. So this is, again, attaching little radio transmitters to bats and following them into the jungle, or forest, I guess, and studying what kinds of habitats they're roosting in, counting the bats as they emerge, and quantifying their habitat preferences. And we conducted radio tracking during both the summer and winter. The summer season is really important for bat populations because that's the maternity season where females form maternity colonies, and their habitat requirements for that time period are really important for the bat populations. And then we also conducted this during the winter because we know next to nothing about what our bats are doing in the winter in this area.
So our bats don't hibernate, they go into torpor. Does the white nose syndrome affect bats in torpor or only in hibernation?
So torpor and hibernation are very synonymous. So hibernation is just kind of a long-term torpor. But when they go into torpor, that's when they drop their body temperatures. And so that's one of the reasons that we're doing this is in this area, the winters aren't too bad. It's pretty mild. You do see bats flying around in the winter, so we don't know how long bats are actually in torpor and how that might affect the severity of white nose syndrome if it arrives in this area. And so we're midway through this research, so this isn't synthesized at all, but this is just to show the diversity of species that we're studying and the types of roosts that we're finding. So in Marin County, we're finding bats mostly in trees and buildings. And some bats are actually moving between trees and buildings, so bats will frequently change roosts every couple of nights. And we have some bats that they'll be in a tree one day and a building the next day. So yeah, they keep us on our toes. In pinnacles, we have a very similar suite of species, but a very different habitat where there's lots of trees also, lots of nice oak trees that have lots of cavities, but there's also amazing rock features and cliffs that bats can roost into. And there we actually are finding lots of bats roosting in cliffs. And so this is an example of a little California Myotis that we tracked, and it went to this giant fir snag. This was in Samuel P. Taylor, and this tree was maybe 80 meters tall, and the bats were near the very top of it, and about 14 California Myotis flew out of it when we were monitoring it. And the bat was there for several nights and then actually moved to another similar tree just down the drain from it. So that bat led us to 2 different roosts. A hoary bat, earlier somebody asked a question about whether hoary bats hibernate or not. So they're thought of as a migratory species. Presumably they migrate so they don't have to hibernate. However, we caught a hoary bat during the wintertime and tracked it to a redwood tree where it didn't leave for about 2 weeks. And this bat could have migrated to the area, but it was also hibernating. And this is actually, I checked with a colleague, Ted Weller, with the Forest Service up in Northern California, who's doing a lot of bat research on hoary bats. And he found similar results with some winter tracking of hoary bats where the bats might be migrating to the area, but they're going for long periods of time without moving during the winter also. And this is just some other examples of bat roosts that we found. So Julia, my colleague, is pointing at a little just wood panel where we tracked a California Myotis about 20 feet from where we caught it to its roosting site, where it was with 4 other California Myotis, just kind of in a woodshed. And it was there for several nights, and then it moved about 3/4 of a mile to this snag that's on the lower right, and 27 bats emerged from that tree. And this was during the maternity season, and this was a reproductive female bat, so that was really interesting. We also had a male California Myotis that was going to this little branch on a fallen down tree. There was some bark, and we could actually see its little antenna sticking out, and it just went to the same spot night after night, or day after day. It's the bat night when it's, yeah, never mind. But yeah, it was, 3 feet off the ground, this little spindly stick off of, coming off of a down tree. In pinnacles, like I said, we have lots of rocky habitat, and we had pallid bats that were in these large rocky outcrops like this, where there was actually a pallid bat maternity colony where dozens and dozens of pallid bats emerged from it. And then we got one of our colleagues from the Park Service to come out and check it out a couple days later, and there was nothing. And it turns out that's actually pretty common with pallid bats, where in other studies where they've tracked them, they found that the entire colony will switch locations every 3 to 4 days throughout the summertime. So trying to think about monitoring this population just makes my head spin, trying to keep up with that, where the entire colony is just kind of hopping around on the landscape. We also had a pallid bat, just a single male that was under this kind of little crevice about 5 feet off the ground, like in this tiny little gap where my pencil is pointing. And then invariably, about half of our bats are going to these massive cliff features. So this is our colleague, Gavin Emmons with the National Park Service, descending down to try and find this bat that was roosting in a crack so we could quantify that habitat. And we're actually getting trained in these methods so we can do the work ourselves. But it's pretty incredible the places that these bats can get to. And then the bats also constantly surprise us. So we had one fringed Myotis roost in a wood rat burrow that was on the side of a stream bank in Pinnacle. So we were tracking it, got to this lovely oak tree with lots of cavities, and we were staring at it for a while, and then I had my antenna, and then realized it was down and to the left, and we actually tracked it to this little wood rat burrow just like on the ground and saw it fly out. We also had a Yuma Myotis that we were tracking up on Mount Tamalpais, and it was going from tree to tree in these nice madrones that had lots of crevices for it to hide in. And then we lost the signal, which is typical while doing these studies. But a couple days later, we were tracking some bats that were in a building kind of close to downtown, and we picked up the signal and actually tracked it to a ventilation system in the porch of a sushi restaurant in downtown San Anselmo. And we were kind of poking around, and we don't know if the bat was night roosting there and somehow dropped its transmitter in the ventilation system, or if it actually gotten in there. But yeah, so we had a sushi bat, which is, quite a surprise. These projects, we're midway through, but we're hoping to be able to provide really important data to the land manager so they can better know what kinds of habitat are important for their bat populations and come up with more effective ways to monitor and manage bat populations. This is also really important data for figuring out how bat populations might respond to things like habitat loss, climate change, the introduction of white nose syndrome into the area, and other pressures that they might face. So and then we're actually developing our projects to look at Western bats in other habitats also. So we're about to be going to Sequoia National Park, where we're gonna try and study bats as they transition from fall into their hibernacula in the wintertime, because while there's lots of caves in Sequoia National Park, it turns out the bats don't actually hibernate in them, except for 1 or 2 species. So this is the kind of work that we're trying to do to figure out where these bats are going, and that could provide clues as how bats might respond to white nose syndrome, because them not being in caves might affect transmission dynamics, make the disease less severe, but it's also going to make monitoring the effects of the disease a lot more difficult if we don't have places where they're concentrated where we can go and count them. Guess I wanted to thank my supervisor, especially for letting me run around and chase bats all over the West, all of you for joining me, and then all of our project partners and funders for all these projects. And when I was starting to get into bats, I would always hear about USGS, and it was just this amazing organization with all this premier science on the cutting edge. And so it's just been such a privilege to be able to do all these projects with them. Able to chase bats into ridiculous situations. So yeah, thank you. And I have time for some questions.
Thanks, Gabe. For our questions, we'll just kind of take a line there at the mic. And if you can't reach that, just raise your hand and I'll be around with this mic.
Okay, thank you, Gabe. So first question was, you mentioned that they live a long time. How long is that?
So some bats are known to live over 30 years. So there's some recovered bands of little tiny little brown bats that were banded like 34 years ago, things like that. So it's an abnormally long time. Some other species are known to live about 8 to 12 years or so. But yeah, that's they're not like mice or rats where they live like 1 to 3 years. It's like, yeah, they live a long time.
And the wind turbines, I think I've heard that there's some developments made on bird-friendly turbines. I guess that would apply to the bats also, until I saw your video of the bat sort of like playing around with a nacelle.
Yeah, so people are actually working on different ways to address those risks. So there's people who are trying to study ultrasonic deterrence, where you basically like blast a bunch of noise and it makes it a terrible place to hang out if you're a bat. Also, you can change the cut-in speed so the turbines don't start operating until the winds are higher, because most of the fatalities occur on nights where it's windy enough that the turbine is operating, but not so windy that the bats stop flying around or trying to forage. And then people are working on a variety of methods to try and reduce those fatality rates. So there's some promising things out there, but none have been super widely deployed yet. So yeah.
And then the last question is one more. Normally you think of bats as hanging out underneath bridges and caves, and probably just live there and stay there. Is that more typical? Because the research you showed that they were, at least Western bats, tend to move. Is that unique of Western bats, or is that just true in bats in general?
So it depends a lot on the season. So some of those really large congregations under bridges or in caves. So there's the hibernacula during the winter time, and that's more of a Eastern and Midwestern phenomenon, and we don't have that in the Western US as far as we can tell. And then in bridges, a lot of times those are maternity colonies. So Mexican free-tailed bats will form, and other species too, will form these giant colonies. And like some bats will stay put throughout the maternity season and stay in the same habitat. But what we're finding is a lot of the bats that are roosting in more transient resources, like snags that are decaying, they'll actually move frequently throughout the entire maternity season. So you'll have a colony, and it might be kind of a fission-fusion network where there's like a larger network of bats that all kind of switch among themselves, or it could be like the pallid bats. We don't know how it is, but it seems like the whole colony is kind of moving at once, and that might be to disrupt parasite cycles. So there's too many fleas and bat bugs and things like that, and so they all move. Or it could be some other, like to deal with some other behavior. But it seems like a lot of bats move frequently, especially in natural habitats.
Okay, thanks again.
Yeah, thanks.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. I have two questions. First, how did the initial white nose syndrome get to Albany?
It's not really known for sure, but it's presumed that it was brought there on a person. So likely somebody was maybe touristing in a cave in Europe somewhere, and then shortly after touristed in that cave, the cave that it first showed up in was a very heavily trafficked tourist cave. So that's the most likely scenario of the original introduction.
Thanks. The second question is the one-tam monitoring you did, was that included, did the monitoring cover migration periods so you could get migratory bats or not?
So our acoustic monitoring is primarily during the summertime when you don't have too many migratory bats. We did kind of go into the migration period. I've actually previously done work in that area focused on migratory bats, so the spring and fall, and it actually seems like it's a migratory hotspot where we would get nights where suddenly you catch like 10 or 12 hoary bats, whereas normally you catch none. So yeah, that's something that we weren't focused on for this main part of the research, but we are interested in kind of working on that angle too.
So was that basically a breeding bat survey then?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's more to
Thanks.
good way to think about it.
I'm sorry. I have two questions also. The first is that in 2017, there was an article in Scientific American on bat language that, like porpoises and dolphins, the Egyptian fruit bat actually has a language, and the babies that are brought up separately from the parents just babble. They don't learn the language.
Yeah.
It's a vocal language, so they are actually like us communicating with a vocal language. And I
Yeah.
wanted to know if the bats in North America or South America, if any of them have been found to have a vocal language. That's my first question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a really good question. So I actually studied social calls on hoary bats for my master's, and they're not very social. They're thought of as solitary, and their social calls are pretty simple. They're like these low frequency upsloping calls that are probably just kind of the equivalent of like, hey, I'm here, or something like that, or get out of here. But other species that are really social and have more complex social structures, like Mexican free-tailed bats, for example, and I don't know too much about the kind of language abilities of a lot of North American bats, but yeah, they have found evidence of babbling, very complex vocal repertoires. And I know in a bat and another species of Molossid, I think they found that they had 26 distinct syllables that they would use, and they would kind of string them together with syntactical rules. So yeah, some of their vocal communication can get pretty complicated.
Yeah, I heard the Mexican free-tails, actually the males sing to their sweethearts.
Yeah, so they have all these little trills and different songs that they use to impress.
And my second question is, we in the South County, we have a lot of old mercury mines. Mm-hmm. And because mercury is no longer mined in the United States, they've been turned into preserves and parks. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, in the 1970s, not too much heed was given to bats that might be in there. And we suddenly found a big decline in our bat populations as the old mining tunnels were just filled in so kids couldn't crawl in and fall down. And so one of the things that was done was to build what we call a bat inn or a bat hotel in one of our parks, which actually has several different species, thousands of bats. But I'm wondering if this is a good solution with the white nose syndrome, getting thousands of bats together in a big bat hotel nowadays, or would this be dangerous and maybe spread the disease? And if it is a good solution, I know Merlin Tuttle, the founder of Bat Conservation International, and he has his own organization now, Merlin Tuttle's Bat Conservation. He actually is having an architect try to build a big bat house that it's located with the roof, and I think the roof in a certain direction, so it's warm in the summer and warm in the winter and cool in the summer, and really good habitat, not just out in the sun, the blaring sun, like we have really hot days here. And it has to be kept clean, because if the guano isn't cleaned out, of course, it's explosive. So is it a good idea to have a big bat hotel nowadays with white nose syndrome, or is it better to, if you want to do something for the bats and they've lost their homes, whether it's an old barn or a mining tunnel, would it be better to do many little bat houses?
That's a really good question, which I don't know the answer to. I can think of, yeah, like bats are normally very social already, and they often congregate at night roosts and stuff. So different species of bats will roost together naturally and come in contact with each other frequently. So kind of focusing just on their roosting habitat and keeping them separate might not affect transmission rates that much. And if it's a really good habitat that allows the bat population to be productive, then that might yeah, play a factor in their conservation. So yeah, I can think of pros and cons for that, and yeah, I have to put a lot more thought into whether or not that's a good idea.
Well, anyway, his bat house, when he gets it done with the architect, will be available to people, and they can contact him at Merlin Tuttle's Bat Conservation down in Texas.
Cool. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I've also got a couple of questions. First off, maybe this is real simple, maybe I just missed it. Why do bats only move around at night? Why are they not, why are they a nocturnal or as opposed to a daytime forager?
I guess because they can echolocate and the day is for the birds, maybe? That's a really good question. Yeah, I would imagine maybe originally it have, well, actually I can think of a couple reasons. So one thing is there's a lot more insect activity at night because insects are really susceptible to desiccation. So while there are birds that act like bats during the day, like swallows and stuff, the night sky has way more, many moths and things like that because they don't have to worry about drying out. So it's probably partly a factor of it just being an abundant resource. But yeah, I could imagine there's benefits. They don't have to deal with hawks.
Well, that was one of my other questions. So
yeah.
what's their natural predator?
Yeah, so for the most part, bats in North America don't have like huge predators that take off like large parts of their population, but some hawks will specialize in bats or kind of learn bat patterns and go and hang out where lots of bats are emerging and pick off some. Raccoons, snakes, some of the hoary bats and other solitary tree roosting bats will be harassed by jays frequently. Yeah, owls will definitely catch bats at night too. But yeah, none of them are super like massive focused predators of bats. Also in Central and South America, there's actually carnivorous bats that will eat other bat species too. So, yeah.
And lastly, if they're insectivores generally, is the use of insecticides showing up in them, and is that poisoning them? How do they respond to all the insecticides we're using?
Yeah, there is some evidence. This isn't a super well researched area, but I know some bat species have had declines that were attributed to insecticide use in the past or pesticide use. And I know people are studying that and have found that insecticides will, or other pesticides will occur in bat tissues and affect their neurology and probably affect them in other ways. It's not a huge area of my expertise, but I know that there are potentially impacts and some people have been studying that.
Good, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have one question. The bat's immune system is very resilient, so they have been combating against a lot of the infectious diseases. So I have a question with this white nose syndrome. Are we studying also how they are going to survive this fungal attack? And because there are species which have been surviving for millions of years.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's a lot of work going into studying how, so the fungus being widespread throughout Europe and Asia is providing a lot of clues about how bats might learn to adapt to it. So in Europe and Asia, they found that they adapt partly by just tolerating it, so they don't mount an aggressive immune response to it. and have all the inflammation that goes along with the disease. So that could be part of it, where they're not just as irritated by it. They just kind of tolerate it. They also co-evolved with it, or it could have caused a decline farther in the past and they got through it. But there could be adaptations in their skin microbiota that provide some protections. And then also larger bats that have larger fat reserves, or bats that don't have to hibernate for as long, so in areas that have a shorter winter period, those bats will have lower mortality rates also. So yeah, we don't have too much evidence yet that North American bats are responding with similar adaptations, but we do see different levels of impacts on different species. And yeah, bats in Europe and Asia that have very similar ecologies do persist with it. So yeah, hopefully that's a promising sign.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much. I was curious about the impact of light pollution on the bat population.
Yeah, that's a big question that I don't know too much about, but it's a very good question. I know some bats, especially some of the more urban adapted bats, like big round bats are kind of notorious for this, will actually just go and forage around streetlights because insects are attracted to them, and they'll just cruise back and forth. And so you, yeah, certain areas where lights attract bats, you know, some bats learn to love that, and it's probably a great foraging habitat for them. Other bats are probably much more sensitive to it and feel much more comfortable in the shadows, and maybe not like to feel so exposed or lit up, because that could increase predation risk, things like that. There is a theory of lunar phobia, which I don't buy, but in general, like when it's a full moon, you don't catch as many bats. And people think that's because of bats avoiding being out in the bright light, so that could potentially be an effect. But yeah, we were radio tracking bats, and like during a full moon, we didn't catch any bats, but all the bats that had radio tags on them, they left their roost just like normal, and we could detect them flying around. So yeah, I'm kind of obsessed with that problem right now, but yeah, I have some other ideas. But
Another sort of odd question is, how can
Yeah.
you tell what sort of bats you have in your own backyard?
you can get a bat detector.
Oh, all right, Christmas is coming.
Yeah. So there's actually different models of bat detectors now that you can hook up to a smartphone or a tablet, and yeah, they'll, like, you know, all the different auto ID algorithms should come with a grain of salt, or, you know, a little disclaimer that they're not 100%. They could misidentify things, but they're a lot of fun. You can go out with them at night and you can't see anything, but you just realize that there's bats flying all over the place. And then you can record their calls and figure out what species you have.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So I had a question too about the acoustic monitoring. Specifically, if it might be possible to identify individuals instead of just species with it. There have been some real breakthroughs in pattern recognition here in Silicon Valley over the last like 5 or 10 years. So I guess my question is the software that you guys are using sophisticated enough that's been using very modern, you know, neural network and machine learning techniques?
Yeah, so they're using machine learning and neural networks to do this. A big issue is that bats don't have super consistent echolocation calls, so they'll actually adjust their calls based on the habitat and what they're doing. So that creates a lot of variation within a species and within individuals. I know there has been research, I think, with captive bats where they were able to train algorithms that could detect individuals with some accuracy, so the potential is there. But yeah, I think it's a problem in that, yeah, the bats are just like super plastic in their calls. So eventually maybe that, yeah, there's potential.
Well, it looks like it's time to wrap up. Thanks, Gabe, and thank you for everyone for coming.
Thank you.
And again, just as a reminder, October 10th is the next lecture. So take a flyer as a reminder.